Well, hey everyone. I hope you enjoyed the first week of class as we started to take a look at some investigative skills and take a look at poppers. So as we were going through those exercises in class, I introduced you to beginning to collect data and using data tables. So let me review a little bit of that with you. And as we go along, make sure you have your notebooks handy. So if you don't have your notebook with you right now, go get it. Pause the recording, go get your notebook, and then come back with your notebook and a piece of paper. So remember when we built a data table, tables are actually made up of two items. There's rows, those are the lines that go across, and then there's columns that run up and down. And although that sounds really simple, it's important because we use those rows and columns to put information in. So it might look something like this. Notice that across the top I have the rows, and I've labeled the rows popper height number 1, height 2, height 3, and then an average height. Notice that every time you build a table, you also need to include labels in your table. So in this case, I have the centimeters is the label for how high the poppers were bouncing. Then on the left-hand side, I have the popper colors. I have blue, yellow, green, and black. Then this is like just an example, but let's say I dropped a blue popper from 3 different heights. I did 14, 12, and 18, and I've recorded that information in my table. Once the table is completely filled out, the next thing I want to do is to find the average height for the blue popper. So in my calculator, I put down 14 plus 12 plus 18, and since there are 3 numbers, I will now divide by 3. And I come up with a number that says 14.6666666666 forever. So I can either leave it as 14.6, or I could round it up in the decimal point to 14.7, or I could just round it all the way up to a whole number, the next whole number, which would be 15. If you don't understand how I rounded it up, we'll talk a little bit more about that in class. Now, in your notebooks, what I'd like you to do, where it says letter A in that table, I'd like you to find the average for the yellow popper. So to remind you how to do that, you'll get a calculator and you'll add 22 plus 28 plus 19 and you'll divide by 3. In your notebook, put a letter A on the next blank page and write down the average for those 3 numbers and make sure you put a cm behind it to stand for centimeters. Do the same thing for the green, that would be letter B, and the same thing for the black popper, that would be letter C. If you need to pause the recording to do that, go ahead and do it. Okay, now on this page, what I'd like to direct your attention to is actually building a data table. So you see letter D is a table, so you're going to sketch that into your notebook and label it letter D. And then we have a set of numbers there. The left-hand number is the amount of water measured in centimeters, and the right-hand number is the mass of fruit that grew off the tree that received that amount of water. I just made this up. It's not a real experiment, so if the numbers don't totally make sense, it's not a big deal. But your job with letter D for the assignment is to make a table. So again, if you need to pause the recording and do that, that's what you should do. Okay, welcome back. Now, we're going to talk about variables. Variables are those things in an experiment or an investigation that change. And we really have 3 kinds of variables that we want to talk about. There's an independent variable that's also called a manipulated variable. There's a dependent variable, which is called a responding variable. And then there's a controlled variable, things that don't change. So let's go back to the poppers for a minute. So picture a popper, and we've turned it inside out, and we put it down on the table, and it popped up to a certain height. So we need to identify the variables. Let's do the controlled variables first, because those are the ones that don't change. So if I've got a blue popper, and I'm only using a blue popper, and I'm putting it in the same place on the table, and I'm bending it back the same way every time, what are those things that don't change? Well, the popper didn't change because I'm always using the blue one. The way that I turned it out, inside out, didn't change because I'm always doing that the same way. And the fact that I put it on a table didn't change. Okay? So those are what we would call the variables that don't change, or they are the controlled variables. Then the next thing I need to figure out is, what was the independent variable? In other words, what did I have control over? Or another way to say that is, what did I manipulate? What did I kind of play around with to change, to make that thing do its thing? Well, in that particular case, it was the fact that I turned the blue inside out, the blue popper. So the blue popper is actually the independent variable. And then the dependent variable, the thing that changed as a result of what I did to the popper, was how high it bounced up. So the dependent variable was the height of the bounce. Another way to look at that would be to say, okay, I manipulated, or I changed the popper, and then when I put it on the ground, on the table, it responded to my manipulation and bounced up. All right? Let me tell a different story and see if it doesn't make sense to you. Let's say that you're supposed to get up in the morning for co-op, and you know that your mom is going to leave the house at 7:45. Okay? And you've got an alarm clock in your room. But one morning you slept in after the alarm went off. Okay? So what did you have control over? What things didn't change? Well, the fact that your mom's going to leave at 7:45 with or without you, that won't change. The fact that you have an alarm clock in your room, that didn't change. All right? So let's say you missed the car ride because you slept in. So what would be the manipulated variable, or the independent variable? Well, let's say that your alarm went off and you reached over and you turned the alarm off, but you went back to sleep. Okay? So, in a sense, what did you have control over in that scenario? Well, you leaned over and you turned the alarm off and you went back to sleep. So that would be the independent variable. The dependent variable would be the fact that you missed the car ride. You didn't get in the car, and so you didn't show up at co-op. All right, so that's responding to the fact that you had control over turning off the alarm, and you chose to turn off the alarm. So that's just another example. You may not get this fully right now, but that's okay. In your notebook, make sure that you have written down the terms that you see on the page right here. So again, if you need to stop and do that, if you need to rewind this and listen to my examples again, go ahead and do that. All right, one last assignment for you, and that is this. I want you to identify the manipulated or the independent, same term, two terms to represent the same thing, or the responding dependent variables in these situations. All right? So in your notebook, write down letters E, F, G, and H, and then you need to write the variable that's the manipulated or independent variable, and then the one that's the responding or the dependent variable. Let me do the first one with you, and then I'm going to let you do the rest of those. So we have lemon trees that are receiving water, and then they produce the largest amount of fruit. So which of those would be independent? If we were doing that experiment, what would we have control over? Would we control how much water we put on the trees, or would we control how big the fruit is? Well, hopefully you said that we would control how much water is put on the trees, so that becomes the manipulated variable. That's the thing we're manipulating, so that's the independent variable. Then the size of the fruit is dependent on the amount of water that we put on. And so that would be the dependent variable. So for letter E, I would write independent variable is water, dependent variable is the size of the fruit. Now you need to do letters F, G, and H. Then bring your notebooks to class next week, and we'll go over those right at the beginning of class and move on to our activity. Thanks.